if they embraced a more balanced approach to transport spending.
She always gives the same speech.
Mr. Speaker.
Denis O'Rourke.
Mr. Speaker, New Zealand First will not support this bill further. We do support, of course, some of its purposes, though, and mandatory disqualification for drink driving offences, and especially indefinite disqualification for repeat drink driving offences, is something that we would definitely support. And also offences of failing to pay for bus or train tickets, which has become a pretty large problem, especially for rail services in Auckland. We would definitely support that as well. And concerning the impounding of cars of fleeing drivers, we do agree that it's necessary to delete the proposed provision because it is inconsistent with the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, and that's the right to be secure against the unreasonable seizure of property. And in any event, it's already possible for vehicles to be impounded under Section 96(1)AB of the Land Transport Act, which is a power to impound vehicles for up to 28 days for failing to stop. So that's already there, and it's a serious issue because fleeing drivers were involved in 29 deaths in the 5 years to 2014-15, and 2,735 fleeing driver incidents were recorded in that year alone, and that's an increase in 1 year of 371. So it shows that this is actually a problem which is getting worse and worse. And New Zealand First would like to see the police use those powers that they do have more than they currently do. This is an offence that has to be stamped out. When it comes to small passenger services, however, this is the part of the bill that New Zealand First can't support. We do agree, of course, that it's silly to have separate rules for taxis and Uber services and others involved in the industry. And one set of regulations ought to mean a level playing field, and we support that. But that doesn't mean that we have to lower standards to provide a carte blanche for Uber services. And in that respect, we say in New Zealand First that the taxi driver industry does have a valid complaint relating to the wholesale lowering of standards across the board, which this bill will inevitably result in. And that is especially in relation to the safety of passengers and drivers. And it does seem that this is a price which the government is willing to pay in order to have and encourage Uber services. But we in New Zealand First say safety first. We say safety of drivers and passengers come before that. And we agree with the accusation made by the taxi drivers through their organisation that Uber drivers have been getting away with blue murder as far as the services that they provide without compliance to the current regulations are concerned. Whereas, on the other hand, Mr. Speaker, the taxi drivers actually have a very fine record of compliance, and we should be encouraging that and not discouraging it. Now, following the Select Committee process, Uber drivers will now be required to obtain a P endorsement, but they should also have to do what taxi drivers are now required to do. And one of those is to have a good standard of English. I would have thought that's absolutely basic for a passenger service provider, absolutely basic for that. And also an area knowledge test, something which is also absolutely basic for somebody who drives people from A to B. How on earth can they provide a proper service without doing that? Those are the things that are being removed by this bill, all to accommodate Uber. And another issue is the removal of mandatory signs on and in vehicles. We say they should stay. Uber vehicles should have the same mandatory signs on and in their vehicles as taxis now do. After all, the signs on the exterior of vehicles could easily be removable. In this day and age, magnetic signs are very easy to obtain. and that could be done without any inconvenience and very little cost to the Uber drivers. Passengers need to know a vehicle that is providing a transport service is an authorised passenger service. People are entitled to know that, and they won't know that if the vehicles aren't signed. And in addition to that, it assists vehicles in being identified as such so that enforcement, when necessary, can easily be carried out. We also deplore the deletion of braille signs, and I couldn't believe my ears when I heard Jonathan Young say, because of his experience in his hometown, where apparently he thinks that only one taxi with braille signs in it should be needed. Well, surely he's been to larger towns than that, where there are a lot of people who need that service, and all vehicles should be required to have braille signs inside them. After all, how difficult is that to do? Very, very little difficulty and very, very little expense in comparison to the huge benefit for sight-impaired people. And the same applies to interior security cameras. Passengers like that idea, and most of all, the drivers like that idea, because it is a safety measure and it provides a record of events which would not otherwise be available. A well worthwhile thing inside taxis as they now are. And why should Uber drivers be exempt from that? Is the expense, is it inconvenient, or do they just don't like it in there for some reason? I don't understand why that's being deleted in this bill. It just doesn't make sense, and it's another reason why New Zealand First will vote against it. And we also regret the loss of the approved taxi organisations, because that's what it'll be, which ensure compliance and the maintenance of standards and compliance with regulations. The loss of those is going to mean a loss of standards across the board, especially when it comes to safety of passengers and drivers, all because Uber could not comply with that. So as a result, we're going to see the demise of those organisations, and that's a sad thing, because it means more drivers taking risks and cutting corners. It's not something we should be agreeing to, and yet this government is doing it just to make sure that we get these Uber services. They'll do anything, apparently, to do that. We say in New Zealand First that this country isn't yet ready for a free-for-all Uber service in the way that you see operating overseas. And that's what this bill is going to do. It's going to do that. It's going to lower standards, and it's all because that the government thinks we need to accommodate Uber. Well, actually, they need to accommodate our legal system and our standards. We deplore that these safety levels will be reduced. And we deplore also, by the way, that Uber takes profits from New Zealand to benefit overseas owners, and that's not the case with most taxi providers. However, having said all that, it sounds pretty anti-Uber, but in fact New Zealand First isn't anti-Uber. In fact, Mr Speaker, all we actually want is a fair deal for taxi operators, and that's not what the parties that are supporting this bill apparently want. All we want are these things, and they're pretty simple. They're pretty simple to provide. First of all, exterior vehicle signage, interior security cameras, interior information in braille, a P endorsement for Uber drivers as well as all others providing a passenger service, an English language test and an area knowledge test. Not until we get those things are we actually going to get a genuine level playing field and a transport system for small passenger service vehicles which will be sustainable, which will be safe, and which could be supported by all parties in the House. But without those things, Mr Speaker, New Zealand First won't be voting for this bill because it is substandard. It's substandard in terms of safety, and it's substandard in terms of providing the great level of service which taxi drivers have built in this country over many years. That's all going to be destroyed simply because this government has had its arm twisted up its back by people who want to provide Uber services. Well, they should be coming to the party and providing the level of service and the safety which our standards currently demand. Nothing less. We'll be voting against.
Dr. Zhang Yan.
Mr. Speaker, I rise to support the